everyone. This is Shane Lynn at MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History, and I'm joined with a very special guest, Amanda Williams. She's the education manager at the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. And while we tell just a small part of General MacArthur's story, since he was born here in Little Rock and only here for 6 months, Amanda has the great job of talking about the general full time. So Amanda, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I think people, we get questions a lot about MacArthur, obviously, because he was born here, and we tell part of the story that we tell of the site in the museum here has to do with him. But really, and I tell folks when they want to know a lot about the general's life, that the MacArthur Memorial, that is your purpose. And so could you tell us a little bit about the memorial and how it got started?
Yes, so we're located in Norfolk, Virginia, and we are a museum, research center, and education center dedicated to preserving and presenting the story of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and that of the millions of men and women who served with him in our nation's wars. Now, we mostly focus on the period of about 1880 to 1964. That's the general's lifetime. But because of his father's military service and the impact his father had on his life, we also kind of go into the American Civil War as well. We are a public and private partnership between the City of Norfolk, Virginia, and the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation. And essentially, if you want to get a sense of who we are as an institution, we are very similar to a presidential library, although obviously we don't honor the legacy of a man who was ever president. He wanted to be president, but that's another story. And so that's just basically who we are. We have the massive research library that we have visiting scholars that will write books about anything from American Civil War, Spanish-American War, Philippines, Asia, occupation of Japan, World War I, World War II, Korea. Lots of books coming out of that archives. It holds all of General MacArthur's personal papers, as well as many of the papers of the men on his staff. And then again, all of those service members from all of those wars, we have collections related to them too. And then we have a pretty vibrant education program that reaches students, the general public, the United States military, and militaries around the world. And we reach about 100,000 people a year just with programming about military history and General MacArthur's life and times.
Right. You know, one of the questions we get here at the museum a lot, and I'll let you, I know the reason, but I want you to be the one to give the answer. But why Norfolk, Virginia? Why is the memorial there?
Right. So that is probably the number one question that we get to. So General MacArthur's mother was born in Norfolk, Virginia. And although he was born in, as you know, in the Little Rock barracks there, apparently, I think she had intended to give birth to her child in Norfolk, where her family was. That doesn't happen. It's kind of hard to time those things, but Norfolk's newspapers announced that he has been born while his parents were away from Norfolk. So the Norfolk newspapers have claimed him from the day that he was born. Now, he never really spent a lot of time here, even as a young boy, but he is very, very close to his mother. She was his chief confidant, probably chief supporter, closest friend, until she dies in the 1930s when he's in his 50s. And you have to remember that he's a family man and also a military child. He spent pretty much all of his life moving from post to post, never really having a hometown, just having his family with him. And so it makes for a very tight-knit MacArthur family. And by the time his mother dies in the 1930s, you know, he's never owned a home. He's lived a very kind of transient life. The next couple decades of his life will be the same. And I think he always looks back to his parents, and you know, all his siblings are dead by the 1930s too. And so he's kind of somebody without a hometown. And I think he looks at his mother's hometown as his kind of adopted hometown. In 1951, after he's been fired by President Truman, he comes to Norfolk, Virginia to dedicate a park, not in honor of himself. He's doing a lot of that around the states, but 1951, City of Norfolk, on the site of his mother's girlhood home, they create a city park and they ask him to come to Norfolk and dedicate it. He does, and he tells the city leaders that he feels like he has come home. Now, he doesn't want to live here, obviously. He makes no effort to ever really kind of do that or come back. But the city leaders remember that. And years in the future, when Norfolk's old City Hall and Courthouse building becomes available, it's vacant, they offer it to him to use as a museum. And he accepts this offer, but on a few conditions. He wants it to really be more of a memorial. He wants to be buried with his wife within the walls of this museum. And he wants it to be open to all people in perpetuity for free. And you have to remember 1960s Virginia, all people is a very important statement because technically there are a lot of rules and laws at that point that segregation is obviously a thing, and museums are not always open to all people equally. But he's very determined that this place, if he decides to come to Norfolk, Virginia and have this museum, that it will be free and open to all people. The building itself was built in 1850. The man who designed the dome of the Capitol building, Washington, D.C. It's a very beautiful building. I think he liked it quite a bit. And so after some more negotiations and some conceptual designs about what the place would look like, he does agree to come here to send all of the artifacts from his life and his personal papers. He wants to open the museum. Unfortunately, poor health prevents that from happening, but it will open on his birthday, January 26, 1964. He dies in April 1964, and then he will be buried within the walls of his museum, thus making it a memorial. So really it's his mom, but then Norfolk City leaders really, really trying to get him to come here. So.
Well, it's a great center and great memorial, and it's when people want to do the research on General MacArthur, it's the place to go and to learn about his life and his legacy. We talked about his accomplishments, or most people know about General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's accomplishments, but you alluded to his father, who was a lieutenant general himself, Arthur MacArthur Jr. But really, MacArthur comes from a very accomplished family on his father's side, because his grandfather, Arthur Sr., will eventually be a judge. He was for 4 days lieutenant governor or governor of Wisconsin, but eventually will be a Supreme Court justice on the D.C. Court there. His brother, he lost his brother Malcolm at an early age, but his brother Arthur III was an accomplished naval officer, having been a veteran of the Spanish-American War as well as World War I. And I tell people, and maybe get your thoughts on this, I think Arthur III would have been as accomplished as Douglas was in the Army. I mean, I think had he not died of appendicitis while on duty, I think Arthur III would have probably been an admiral in the Navy. He had those, the MacArthur military heritage. And so just your thoughts on that. Of course, his father was a veteran of the Civil War, which you talk about, why you talk about that at the museum. And so his father was very accomplished. I think people don't realize we think of General MacArthur in the 20th century as a great general. I think people of the 19th century would have certainly known that General MacArthur, Lieutenant General Arthur MacArthur.
Yes, of course. And you're right about his entire family, those MacArthur men. They are all highly accomplished, completely devoted to public service or to military service. They all are men who I think have a strong sense of their own destiny, and that kind of comes down through his grandfather, father, brother. And they're all men that, love them or hate them. Some are more charming than others, obviously. Some are a little more controversial than others. All of them, with the exception of maybe Arthur III, have a knack for upsetting people who are president or maybe who one day will be president. But really, love them or hate them, they are incredibly gifted and very good at whatever profession they end up in. And no one, even the people that don't like them, can kind of say that they're not good at their jobs. You're right about his grandfather, Arthur MacArthur Sr. He was an immigrant. He came over from Scotland in 1828, becomes a lawyer, gets involved in politics. And you're right, he becomes governor of Wisconsin in 1855, I think. He's only governor for a few days, though, because there's basically some pretty bad election fraud that's kind of been involved in the 1855 election there. He had been elected as lieutenant governor, but he steps in as governor when the actual governor has to step down because of the fraud. We don't think he had anything personally to do with the election fraud, but still not great for your reputation. But he goes on. He serves on a circuit court in Wisconsin. Then President Grant appoints him to the Supreme Court of the District of Columbia. And so he lives for a while in Washington, D.C. He's a very learned man, very kind of cosmopolitan. He's interested in causes from higher education to the SPCA. He was very interested in the welfare of animals. And he's a huge influence on young Douglas MacArthur. Again, he's very charming, interested in education. And I think he really passes a lot of that on to his grandson, along with this idea that we are men of destiny and we take on these major public roles and we serve to the best of our abilities. Douglas MacArthur's father, Arthur Sr.'s son, Arthur MacArthur Jr., his father wants him to follow his path. He wants him to be a lawyer, probably a politician or a judge someday. He's just interested in the Army. He will be a Medal of Honor recipient for his service in the American Civil War. His career will progress kind of slow during the years between the American Civil War and kind of the early 1900s. But when it does kind of accelerate, it accelerates very quickly. And he will see duty in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. He will serve as somewhat of an observer during the Russo-Japanese War. And, he, unlike his father, is probably a far more serious man, but very devoted to his duty. He's going to retire from the Army as a lieutenant general, but he probably, technically he probably should have been chief of staff of the Army. I think that is what he wanted most in his career. Again, these MacArthur men have the ability to alienate presidents or people who will become president. And so he's kind of not given that promotion. And back then, I think there was only room for one lieutenant general in the Army at a time. And, if you're not given that chief of staff position, you don't really have a job. And so he'll kind of leave the Army a little disappointed that he's not given that top job, even though he has the rank that would make any other command kind of a demotion. So he'll leave the Army, but again, he instills in both of his sons, both of his surviving sons, this idea of military service and that we are men of destiny and we are really good at what we do. But in the case of Douglas, it might also come with a sense that politicians maybe stab us in the back sometime. Arthur III, Douglas MacArthur's oldest brother, he's going to join the Navy. I think you're absolutely right. I think that he was on track to become an admiral. And as historians, we don't really like to deal with what ifs. But I think he's probably one of the most interesting what ifs in the MacArthur family, because had he not died of appendicitis in the 1920s, I think he was probably on track at some point to become chief of naval operations. And just this fascinating what if is that, say by World War II, you have two MacArthurs in uniform, one basically top of the Navy, and then you've got Douglas MacArthur out in the Pacific. How might that have influenced Douglas MacArthur's relationship with the US Navy during World War II? How would that have influenced US strategy in World War II? Would it have been a Europe first strategy, or would it have been more equal or maybe more focused on the Pacific? And so A lot of what ifs there, but all three of these guys are high performing men of destiny and absolutely assured that their job is duty on our country, whether that's public service or military service. So it's a very interesting family, and all very, very good at what they do, and all supported, all support each other quite a bit. Very good relationships between all of them.
Right. I I think that um, we sometimes get focused on General Douglas MacArthur because obviously he was the latest in history that we know about. And but when we go back and look at his family's accomplishments, from reading about the MacArthurs, Arthur the second, what as you said, was very serious. I often thought that maybe Douglas was more like his grandfather. His grandfather was very outgoing. He liked to host parties. He was very gregarious from the accounts, and was a little bit different than Arthur Jr. He, as you said, he was much more serious than his father was.
I think he was probably a good mix of both.
Right.
In terms of being charming, I mean, he could charm anybody. I mean, the reason Inchon happens is he basically charms the pants off the guy sent to tell him no, the chief of naval operations at the time. Even if you hated him, if you got in a room with him, I think his intellect and his charm could just turn you into a disciple, by the time you left the room. That being said, I think in terms of his private life and, even in his kind of official diplomatic capacity in different jobs he had, he doesn't really like parties.
Right.
He doesn't particularly like socializing, especially after World War I. And, there's probably a lot of good reasons for that. A lot of those guys came back from that war and they were not the person they were when they left for France. But I think he's a wonderful mix of both of those men. And they both certainly had a huge role to play in his development as a leader.
Well, you're the education manager there, and it's sort of a kind of a loaded question. It's kind of like what, do you have a favorite child? But is there a certain part of the general's life that you enjoy talking about, or that's something that you really enjoy and you want the public to know about?
Right. All of it, right? How do you pick a favorite part?
Right.
World War I is fascinating, I think. He meets George Patton in that war. He's the recipient of Sub and Silver Stars. He goes from major to brigadier general in, I think, about 18 months or so. And then he's a general officer for the next 4.5 decades of his life. That, I think, is pretty interesting. But I think what strikes most people the most about his career is when they hear about the end of his life. And he's kind of a figure that most people think they know, whether you love him or hate him, like you think you know everything about him, but most people don't know about his final years. And, and so I really like talking to people about that. Here you have this guy who served for over 52 years. He's been at the forefront of a lot of major world events. He has been a constant student. I mean, he was a huge believer in lifelong learning. And at the end of his life, he's interested, I think, in three big things: space, technology, and China. And, he's basically predicting in the late 1950s and 60s that new battle spaces are emerging, kind of in the field of space and computers. And then he's also pointing to China as kind of a future rival of the United States. And China may not be a surprise to a lot of people because of his role in the Korean War and his testimony after that war. But a lot of people think he's kind of nuts in the 1950s and 60s because China is this kind of this communist state, a lot of warlords. Most people think of it as kind of having a very depressed economy, and they can't see it as a future threat. And he is basically arguing in the 50s and 60s that China will become an economic and military power, and that it will be able to challenge the United States it's going to be a world power. It's going to be a superpower.
Wow.
And so obviously he was right about that, but obviously we have the benefit of hindsight. He didn't. Now, in terms of technology and space, I think a lot of people are surprised that here you have this 80-year-old general who's more of a believer in space and computers than a lot of young people in the 50s and 60s were. And again, people thought he was nuts about that, but he believed that things like satellites, things like cyber computers would become important parts of our infrastructure and could also be militarized. And so, if Alfred Thayer Mahan is saying that, in the 19th century, to be in charge of the world, to have an empire, you have to control the seas. MacArthur around this time is saying that in the future, of course, you're going to need land forces, naval forces, air forces, but you're also going to need to have a presence in space. You're also going to need to have a presence in this kind of new world of technology. You have to dominate these new battle spaces or someone else will. And whoever that is, they will dominate everyone else. And so I think he kind of sees that before a lot of people. I think it's hard to see into the future like that, and even harder to articulate. And, most people don't listen to him, but I think that's really fascinating. I mean, he's a very controversial figure. He makes a lot of big mistakes. He does a lot of amazing things in his career. But I think at the end of his life, the benefit of all those years of service and education gives him a very clear perspective on our future. And so I really like talking to people, I think, about that, because I think that is one of his big legacies to us.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, like you said, most people, when they talk about General MacArthur, they obviously focus on World War II and Korea. But I also think people forget how incredibly brave he was, especially in World War One. I mean, he was gassed. But he led his soldiers from the front. And he received a number of medals for his service, and had not probably been his relationship with Blackjack Pershing not being great, he probably should have received the Medal of Honor for some of his actions in World War One.
I agree.
He was passed over for one, incident.
Yeah, I think, and this might be a little controversial, but I think you can make the case that it's World War One was probably a more appropriate moment for him to receive the Medal of Honor. World War II is obviously very controversial for a number of reasons. But World War One, I think, far more legitimate moment for that to have happened. But as you said, your relationship with your commander is important. But then I think there was also generally a policy where you wouldn't give something like that to a general officer. And I think when he's being nominated or considered for that, I think he's already a brigadier general at that point. So I think there's a sense that this is not an award for generals, whether they're in the field or not. So.
Well, thank you for being here. Before I let you go, though, I want to ask you a few things about if you could talk about some of the exhibits that you have going on or some of the things that are coming up there at the memorial.
Okay, so right now we just opened a new special exhibit. It's about MacArthur and mass media. And it's a very interesting exhibit because it kind of it covers MacArthur's relationship with the press and the role that the media plays in the perception of heroes, villains, and major events. And it also traces MacArthur's evolution as a pop culture figure and highlights the continued international resonance of his image. I mean, he's cross-culturally, he's one of the most recognizable people in the world even today, even if all you see is a silhouette of the corncob pipe and the hat. It also kind of, I think, explores some interesting ideas about him as an extraordinary communicator, as a master propagandist, as a master of information operations. And I think it invites people to think about, how would he have been today in today's media? Can you imagine a Douglas MacArthur on Twitter? That I think would be kind of interesting. In addition to that, we also have two main podcast series that the museum produces. And if you're interested in World War I history, we produce the World War I history podcast. You can find that on our website, on iTunes, or whatever podcast directory that you use. And if you want a more focused look at MacArthur history, we have the MacArthur History Podcast, where we talk about a lot of the controversies. We interview a lot of subject matter experts and authors, and we also take requests. So people are welcome to kind of reach out to us if there is a MacArthur topic or a World War I topic that you are interested in. We would love nothing more than to explore that in depth with an expert or through research on site, and create an episode about that. So feel free to reach out to us anytime. That is what we are here for.
Well, thank you for being with us. We appreciate your partnership between our museum and your museum, the memorial there. We have a great relationship, and it's fitting that we are able to work together on the life of an extraordinary American. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Right. Well, it's my pleasure. And I've also had the pleasure of visiting your museum several times over the last 5 years or so. And it's also a wonderful museum. And I would encourage anyone who hasn't been there yet to stop by for a visit. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you. And the same to be said for the MacArthur Memorial. So, and I think we've skipped over, but his wife, Jean, is also buried there, right?
Yes, his wife, Jean, another devoted supporter of his. She's also buried in the rotunda beside him.
Great. It's a great story. I hope people will, if they can, at least come visit right away. We'll go to, you have a wonderful website. You can find all the podcasts and other programs that you do. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.